Welcome to the special edition of the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary, and we are doing some special shows as we are on break, taping them early. Today's show will be dedicated to our favorite memoirs. And by our, I mean executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
So the memoir, as old as time itself, almost. I don't know what the first great memoir was. Maybe Augustine's Confessions. So that would have been 5th century CE, something like that. But obviously, the craze of the last 20 years has been nothing but solipsistic memoirs by people who shouldn't be writing memoirs. But there are great memoirs throughout history and in modern times. And so we're going to make some recommendations to you of memoirs you may not have read that have special meaning to us. Again, we're not saying that this is the greatest of memoirs or this is something you must read because it is we want to talk about books that have an emotional meaning and resonance for us. So Christine Rosen, you are first up with your.
Okay, so I would have recommended Montaigne's essays, but because I feel they are a kind of memoir. He really does explore his own life and his experiences, but it's not officially categorized as memoir, but you all should read them anyway. They're wonderful. But I picked, actually, I'm glad you mentioned the turn that modern memoir has taken, because I think there was a moment for the book that I chose, and I liked it for this reason. It's Maxine Hong Kingston's 1976 book called The Woman Warrior. And the subtitle is interesting. It's Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts. So she was born in America. Her parents were Chinese immigrants. And what she does in this memoir is pretty straightforwardly mix fact and fiction. So she's a novelist. I think she's also published some poetry. But she pretty much says these ghost stories. She has voices in the book that are the supposed folk tales, ghost stories, and she kind of goes back and forth between describing her own life growing up, as well as these ghost stories, which hark back to obviously to China. There's a kind of completely off the wall section where she reimagines herself as the Chinese heroine Mulan. This is before the big Disney movie came out and everybody knew who Mulan was. It's in the 70s. So it's a little wacky. She's obviously highly narcissistic, but it's wildly entertaining. And I liked it for a number of reasons. This was a period in American history where Asian culture more broadly was not given the kind of richness and cultural treatment that we now take for granted today. She came out of a culture where you were either, described as someone who ran a laundry, did martial arts, or, ate chop suey. It was quite a limited sort of cultural understanding that Americans had of Chinese immigrants. So I enjoyed it for what it taught me about that. But I also was thinking of James Fry's memoir, A Million Little Pieces, and other memoirists in the modern age who pretended not to blend some fiction and nonfiction, and so ended up actually being scandalized as a result. She's pretty clear about this. It's also given us, in a weird way, some interesting memoirs that are quite meticulous and reported out, like David Carr's Night of the Gun. He was a reporter who wanted to go back and look at his own life during his drug-addicted years and figure out what was true about his memory and what might have been false. She just messes it all up in one big kind of interesting package. So that's the memoir that I remember kind of striking me. I don't think it's the best memoir ever written, but Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior.
Okay. Abe, you want to?
So
Want to jump in here?
I'm going with one that's from this century. The novelist Martin Amis, the late novelist Martin Amis, who just died. In my 20s, I really worshipped him. I came to have a lot of problems with him. Still think he was a great writer, but namely, he seemed very out of touch and self-involved, and I think that informed a lot of his politics but the thing about his self-involvement is that it pays off in memoir, because his 2000 memoir Experience I think is a really terrific book. It's really all about his growing up as the son of Kingsley Amis, the great British comic novelist, well, varied novelist, and writer. Um, the very strange inner workings of their family. Kingsley and Martin's mother divorcing, but her having to live with him because he had all sorts of phobias and inabilities after their divorce. And it's about Martin Amis himself becoming a writer, his own entanglements, family, his divorce, and finding out later in life that he had another child, meeting her only as an adult, and how his stepmother, Kingsley's second wife, the novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard, sort of made Martin a student of literature and sort of got him into writing. And it's just a great, beautifully written confessional book. And it was important to me because at the time, I was sort of playing with the idea of being a writer, and then I read it, and it kind of it solidified actually for me that it's what I wanted to do. And then I think I sold this, I wrote and sold the story some months after that. So that's Experience, Martin Amis.
Great. Matt Conetti?
These are very good recommendations. I'm going to recommend two memoirs. The first is actually 2 volumes, and these are the memoirs of Elie Wiesel. All Rivers Run to the Sea is volume 1, and The Sea is Never Full is volume 2. I read the first volume when it came out in the mid-1990s, and was entirely captivated. I, like most American public school attendees, had read Night in the 8th grade, which is his memoir of the Holocaust. And the book
he
that
nominally called that a novel, by the way.
Yes, I mean it's a little bit
very
difficult.
odd because it's very hard to. It's a fictionalized memoir of Auschwitz,
right,
but
exactly,
it isn't really a memoir, right?
You're right about that. And in fact, in All Rivers Run to the Sea, he talks about the process of writing Night and what parts were slightly fictionalized. But then, of course, also recounts his actual experiences as a Romanian Jew caught up in the Shoah. And then he talks in the first volume about his career in journalism after the war, eventually becoming a writer, the French novelists he admired. And then the second volume is very political because of his stature. Elie Wiesel was involved in so many big causes. He continued to write, of course, many books and plays, many books about Judaism, about Hasidism. Anyway, both volumes are incredible, and they really opened up a world of ideas and Judaism and history that I could just continue to immerse myself in and return to those books. So that's the memoirs of Elie Wiesel. The other memoir I want to recommend is 1 volume, but it's one very large volume, and that is the memoir of Sidney Hook. It's called Out of Step, A Life in the 20th Century. Sidney Hook was a philosopher. He was a student, apprentice, really, of John Dewey, one of the leading lights of American pragmatism. He was a man who began as a son of Jewish immigrants, began on the left, including the fellow traveling left, never joined the Communist Party, but was very close to communists, went to Soviet Russia not long after the establishment of the Soviet Union, but then very quickly began turning against communism, recognizing it for what it was. And by the 1930s, Hook was a very prominent anti-communist socialist, anti-communist liberal / socialist. He never really gave up the label socialist to describe himself, even as he moved to the center, even on economic questions throughout the course of his very long life. Sidney Hook was a remarkable person and an incredible intellectual influence on many of the figures who would become known as the neoconservatives. He was a longtime contributor to Commentary. He was a tough liberal. He always believed that if you wanted a world where liberal values of freedom and individualism were triumphant, that required a deterrence. It required the ability and the will to use force in defense of freedom. And that shaped the minds of many people. Reading this book, Out of Step, is, again, just an incredible a kind of eye-opening experience, because you hear about his interactions with Albert Einstein, his interactions with Bertrand Russell, his fights with Herbert Marcuse, and because he became involved in all of these controversies over the course of his long life. I understand that Out of Step, which is about 900 pages long, is actually only half of the original draft. And so one of these days, I do want to go to the Hoover Library and sit down and read everything that Sidney left out, because it is just such a remarkable book. So that is Out of Step by Sidney Hook.
Can I tell a quick story about Elie Wiesel and how he became a writer because of Abe's evocation of the fact that reading books is the kind of thing that makes people become writers. If you're like me and you come from a family of writers, it's almost like you come from a family of shoemakers. But each of you did not come from a family of writers, and therefore writing had to be something that something had to happen to make you think this is something I want to do, that I have the confidence to do, and all of that. And Wiesel tells an extraordinary story, though he was nominally a writer when this incident happened. The thing that made him Elie Wiesel was an encounter that he had in 1954 with the French writer Francois Mauriac, which he tells in this memoir. And he was interviewing him he was a journalist, and he was interviewing Mauriac, who was then 70 years old and the most famous writer, I think, in France, or the most garlanded writer in France. And he was a very very Catholic, mystical Catholic almost. Wiesel said at the time that Mauriac was famous, old, and rich, covered with honors, comfortably ensconced in his Catholic faith, while Elie, was young, poor, riddled with doubts, a solitary, stateless person, unknown and Jewish. Mauriac talked about how he admired Jews, and he talked about Jesus, because that's one of the reasons he admired Jews, was because Jesus was a Jew, and all of that. And he was Wiesel got offended and said, you talk of Christ, but not very far from here, I knew Jewish children, every one of whom suffered 1,000 times more, 6 million times more than Christ on the cross, and we don't speak about them. And he stormed out of the apartment, out of Mauriac's apartment, and Mauriac ran after him, grabbed his arm in the stairwell, and burst into tears, hugged him, wept, and said he wanted to know why Wiesel hadn't written about his experiences of the Holocaust, and that he said he must speak out. And that because of Mauriac, he sat down and wrote Night and became Elie Wiesel. This moment where Mauriac was seized with shame and believed that God had sent Wiesel to him to make him repent of his own arrogance and sins. It's one of the more amazing stories of the sort of the origins of a major historical figure. And so you brought it to mind, so I had to. So now I guess it's that is evoked, and I actually haven't read those books, I have to confess.
Oh, the stories are told in the first volume. And one important lesson of that story is it helps explain the Frenchness of Wiesel's writing style. He's very aphoristic. He asks a lot of rhetorical questions throughout his books. It's the very short sentences, which of course I like. But you really get that sense that obviously growing up in Siget, the village where he lived before the Shoah, was a profound influence on Elie Wiesel, but also French intellectual culture, which I thought was interesting, because when he's there in France as a stateless person after the war, and he begins writing for Israeli newspapers, and he's very much involved in French intellectual life, and that kind of he absorbs that, and I think that really affects his writing style, including when he moves to New York. And in the second volume, he talks about his many years teaching at Boston University as well.
Right. All right. So I'm also I got to go Jewish. I've got two books I want to mention. One is famous and actually is connected to commentary this year because it is the memoir of Natan Sharansky, Fear No Evil. Natan Sharansky will be the 2024 commentary roastie. Go to commentary.org/roast to find out more. Fear No Evil, which was published just, I think, a year after Sharansky left or was, finally was allowed to leave the Soviet Union, is the story of his life as a kid who went from, as he says, being a slave to being a free person. And there are many interesting details in this story. It's an absolutely wonderful, riveting, heartwarming, heartrending book because 9 years of it takes place in a Soviet prison. And it is in the prison that he realizes that he is a free man, that he knows who he is, that he has a cause and a purpose in life. And he spends much of his time in prison playing chess inside his own head against himself and building memory palaces so he can remember things that not allow his life there to destroy his sense of who he is. And of course, concludes with the one of the most indelible scenes of the 20th century, which is when he, then, by the way, known not as Natan Sharansky, but as Anatoly Sharansky, changed his name to a more Hebraic. He wanted to go to Israel, right? That was he was the original, one of the leaders of the Refuseniks. He is the plane lands, flown out of Russia. He lands on a tarmac, I think, in Italy, and the KGB says to him, "Okay, you walk now. Go walk straight to the plane that's going to take you to your next destination." And he gets out of the plane, and rather than walk a straight line like Alan Arkin and the In-Laws, he goes serpentine. He just meanders and wanders back and forth around the tarmac because his last act as someone in the care or whatever in the world of the slavery of the Soviet Union was going to be to defy this last order from his captors. It is a glorious book co-written with William Novak. Interestingly enough, William Novak, the father of B.J. Novak, the actor, novelist, children's book writer, film director, made the movie Revenge. Anyway, it's an extraordinary book, and it's every page is glorious. The less well known is a book that I read 5 or 6 years ago, and blew my socks off, by a writer named Joseph Berger. Joseph Berger, that byline may be familiar to people because Joseph Berger wrote about both New York metropolitan issues and Jewish issues, particularly ones connected to the Jewish faith, for the New York Times for 30 or 40 years. And he was maybe one of the 2 or 3 best prose stylists on the paper in all that time.
And he also recently wrote a biography of Elie Wiesel.
Elie Wiesel, that's right, for the Yale
series. Yeah.
Yes. So Joseph Berger wrote a memoir in 2001 called Displaced Persons. And it is about his upbringing. His parents were Holocaust survivors who met in a DP camp in Europe, married. He was born there, and they came to America and were settled on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, about a block from where I am speaking to you right now, among other Holocaust survivors who kind of were moved into this neighborhood by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And it is a story of his life and upbringing with his parents, who had this unique double experience, one of which was that they had survived the worst thing that could ever have happened to any people forever, and came to America to live a new life, having lost everything, including other families and other children and things like that. Came here and lived a life of some penury. His father ended up working at a job he hated for decades in Newark, New Jersey, though they lived in Manhattan. They weren't going to move away from the community of survivors and religious Jews that they had found themselves in. But his father never looked for a closer job, never looked for a job that he might enjoy more, because it somehow he probably felt that it wasn't really his. It's one of the questions in the book as to why this would have been, that his father allowed himself to have a job that he had to 4 hours a day commuting to, didn't like, came home, ate dinner, fell asleep in a chair, got up the next morning, went to work. And his mother had to gather money to pay for his Jewish day school education, like in a sock that, give it. That's how they thought about money. Give it to the bursar at the school, because she didn't really understand about how to use banks and banking. And then it's the story of his growth into being an American kid with this haunted legacy of his parents and the community that they lived in. And he describes in one scene how classic Saturday afternoon after synagogue, Jews don't use electricity. So they would go out and sit on the stoops, and their kids would be playing on the sidewalk. And that he sort of realized that watching this world, watching them talk to each other and look at their kids, that these kids, this world of people that they had brought back from who had been born in the wake of this, unthinkable catastrophe, that they fully understood that these kids were the reason that they were still here. And that it was unspoken. It wasn't. They weren't treated like blocks of gold, and they weren't particularly full of emotional uplift about it or anything like that. But that out of the horror, they were determined to make something real for themselves and something enduring for themselves, and they did. And Joseph Berger is one of those enduring things that they made for themselves in the wake of the catastrophe. And his book Displaced Persons, which is a small American masterpiece, is also one of those, a memoir that is much larger than it seems in that sense, because what it evokes is what it means that it could have been written at all. So just to go back through our choices, we got Abe Greenwald with Experience by Martin Amis. We have The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston from Christine, who also recommends Montaigne's essays, finest flowering of the 16th century French intellectuals, who are evoked in the 20th century by Matt's choice of Elie Wiesel's two-volume memoir. And you have
and Sidney Hook's
Out of Step, which is a by the way, a surprisingly delightful book.
It's amazing.
Sidney was a very cheerful person, but I wouldn't describe him as a light-spirited person. But this book is kind of full of fun.
There's some wit involved, and he explains at length why he's right about everything.
Yes,
and why everyone else is wrong. And the fact is, Sidney Hook, let's say 95% right about everything.
There you go. And then I chose Fear No Evil by Natan Sharansky and Displaced Persons by Joseph Berger. So thanks for listening. We will be back in good order. So for Christine, Matt, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.